with Charlie Adelson and his mother Donna now both convicted for their respective roles in Dan Markel's unaliving, which occurred on July 18th of 2014. We all wait with bated breath to see if Dan's ex-wife Wendi Adelson will once and for all be charged in connection with Danny's brutal death. Welcome to Bed Crime Stories. I'm your host, T. Thank you for joining me today. Do me a favor, smash that like button and please subscribe to the channel. And if you like my work and want to support it, please consider a Patreon membership. It's only $1.99, and you can find out how to do that in the description of this video. Those of you following this case know that Wendi was the Adelson who gained the most from Dan Markel's death. Dan's body was barely cold when Wendi hightailed it out of Tallahassee, Florida with her and Dan's two sons, Benjamin and Lincoln. And with her pockets full of life insurance money, Social Security benefits for the two young boys, money from the sale of Dan's house on Trescott, a Holocaust diamond from Dan's family, and more. Wendi made out like a bandit from Dan Markel's death, and according to her ex-boyfriend, Jeff Lacasse, it wasn't long before she was cracking jokes about Danny getting his head blown off. Pretty insensitive to speak in such terms about an innocent man who was unalived, who also happens to be the father of your kids. So Wendi opted for jokes over genuine empathy and grief when she was away from the police and with friends. Today, I want to revisit Wendi Adelson's actions on the day of the crime, Friday, July 18th, 2014. I think there are clues in her actions that day that could point to her foreknowledge of what was going to happen to Dan Markel just around 11 a.m., and that's when two hitmen hired by her brother, Charlie Adelson, pulled into Dan's driveway. And one of them, Sigfredo Garcia, approached Dan as he sat in his car, and Garcia fired 2 shots at his face and head. Detectives with the Tallahassee PD took Wendi's cell phone and celebrated its contents on the afternoon of July 18th, 2014. Basically, that means they extracted the data from Wendi's cell phone, all the calls she made, text messages that were exchanged, voicemails that were on the phone, etc. Detectives would later discover that Wendi had a calendar entry for 8 a.m. that day, July 18th, and the entry read, quote, "Fix TV," end quote. This was in reference to the television that Wendi claims her brother Charlie bought her as a divorce gift. Wendi had told a lot of people, including the detective here, that her brother Charlie once joked that he looked into hiring a hitman to off Dan Markel, but he found out it was cheaper to just buy her a TV. So that television is highly symbolic in this case. And it just so happens that the TV suddenly got a massive crack in its screen, a crack that Wendi blamed on her two young sons, who were both under the age of 5 at the time. Keep in mind that Wendi's boyfriend at the time, Jeff Lacasse, said that the crack looked like an adult of a certain height would have had to have created it. The crack was high enough and deep enough that only an adult could have made that damage, or rather created that damage. To me, it sounds like Jeff believes Wendi may have deliberately cracked the screen in order to have a good excuse for having the Best Buy repairman over that morning, the morning of the crime. Perhaps that was done to be part of Wendi's alibi for the day, because Wendi knew that as the ex-spouse of the person who was injured, Dan Markel, the cops were definitely going to look at her first as a potential suspect. As we go through Wendi's timeline that day, you're going to see that she was a very busy lady all morning. And she made sure to keep the receipts literally and figuratively. Now, this is me speculating because Wendi has not been charged with any crime yet. And that TV may very well have been damaged by her sons, but my gut says no. I personally believe Wendi inflicted the damage, but that's just my opinion. And I think she did it so that she could have the repairman over at her house that morning as part of her alibi to account for the time when Dan Markel was injured. As it turned out, she said that the repairman was there until about 10, and the crime actually occurred just around 10:55 to 11 a.m. So Wendi needed to do a few other things if she wanted to create a total alibi for that period. Now note that Wendi deleted that calendar entry, fixed TV, before the police asked for her phone. I thought it was odd that she did that, but apparently she would often delete items from her calendar after they occurred. Back to the timeline, so 8 a.m. fixed TV. Then at 8:09 a.m., there was a call from Wendi to her mother, Donna. The call lasted for only 34 seconds, thus it's likely Donna did not answer the call. Donna called Wendi right back. It looks like maybe they were playing phone tag. Then Donna texted Wendi and said, "Best Buy just called me, but I told them to confirm with you they are on their way over now to help with the TV sets in your living room." End quote. Don't know why Wendi couldn't make her own calls to Best Buy. Then at 8:20 a.m., Wendi sends a text to her brother Charlie that says, quote, "This is so sweet," end quote. Now, Wendi deletes this text before she hands her phone over to the police later on in the day. Why did she delete it? What was so sweet? Was that about something sweet that Charlie said or did? Of course, only Charlie and Wendi know the answer to that. Then at 9:04 a.m., Dan Markel leaves a voicemail for Wendi. I'm going to play that voicemail for you right now.
And do you have that voicemail where you could play it for us?
I believe so.
Hey Wendi, Dan, good morning. It's 9 o'clock on Friday. Just wanted to break down something to pick the boys up early this afternoon and take it to dinner. And then have them ready for you around 4:30 or 5. Get them up. So either at Tuesday or at the house. So let me know if that is okay with you. And also I'd love to chat to you about that situation for school. And Thursday stuff and all that. I'm going to be at the gym probably between 9:15 and 10:30. But I did chat. You know, for a walk in school, just like that. So, okay, bye.
What time was that voicemail left for Wendi Adelson?
9:04 a.m.
8 minutes later, at 9:12 a.m., Charlie calls Wendi and the call is just 29 seconds long. Also at 9:12 a.m., Wendi texts Dan Markel to say, quote, "Repairman at my house right now. I am picking the boys up at 3 p.m., so your swim idea is a no-go today." So clearly between 9:04 a.m. when Dan left the voicemail and 9:12 a.m. when Wendi texted Dan to say that his swimming idea was not going to happen, Wendi listened to Dan's voicemail. Now note that the hitmen were already tailing Dan Markel at the time. They tailed him from his house to the boys' school and then to the gym and then from the gym back to Dan's house. Now, at 9:13 a.m., Dan sends a very brief, concise text to Wendi. He says, quote, "My day ends at 4:30 p.m. under our schedule, and you had them until 5 p.m. last week," end quote. So Dan's cheerfulness from that earlier voicemail is now replaced by a rather curt reply. He's telling Wendi that she doesn't just get to pick up the boys at 3 p.m. because legally he still has custody up until 4:30 p.m. under their agreement. At 9:15 a.m., Wendi sends Dan another text that reads, quote, "Because you needed to food shop," end quote. She's saying that, okay, I had the kids until 5 p.m., but that was because you needed to go to the store to get food before I dropped them off. Dan replies, quote, you weren't making them available until 5. Wendi responds, if it was 4:30 last Friday, you should have told me that. Why tell me now? You can see how they would go back and forth at each other. But to me, it was Wendi who started the nastiness during this exchange, not Dan. Dan sounded very hopeful and friendly and nice and amenable in the voicemail. Then at 9:19 a.m., Wendi calls Charlie and they speak for 18 minutes and 17 seconds. 18 minutes. So I wonder what Wendi and Charlie were talking about. We know Charlie hired the 2 hitmen who were trailing Dan Markel as he texted Wendi. In my opinion, it's very hard to believe that Wendi didn't know about the hitmen. And I also find it interesting that Wendi was being snarky to Dan in her text messages. Was she doing that because she knew the cops would be looking at those communications after Dan was shot? Was she trying to reflect the mood and tone of her other texts on other days to Dan? Or was Wendi simply relishing giving Dan Markel a hard time? If she did know that the crime was going down, and I'm just speculating, and that it was going to go down in about 2 hours, you'd think she'd maybe be kind to Dan, knowing he would soon lose his life. And if she did know, I have to believe she was being snippy because she was trying to replicate her usual tone that she used with Dan Markel. They were, after all, embroiled in a vicious custody battle. They were fighting over money. By 9:19 a.m., Danny was at his gym. So maybe Wendi was filling Charlie in on Dan Markel's timeline that morning, when he'd be done working out at the gym. Dan sent another text message to Wendi in which he responded to her earlier text where she said, so why tell me now? Dan replies, because I was being nice, end quote. And then Wendi replies once again with a snarky text. It reads, nice was fun while it lasted. See you at 4:30 p.m. today at my house. End quote. To me, I see Dan trying to be kind in all of his messages and Wendi being the one with the aggressive, unkind responses. And I'm not just trying to attack Wendi Adelson. This is honestly what I'm seeing here. If she knew about the crime, then she also had to have known that she would not see Dan later at her house at 4:30 p.m. Dan Markel at this point only had 1 hour left before he would be shot. At 9:38 a.m., Charlie calls his mother Donna, but she doesn't pick up. At 9:57 a.m., Charlie calls his girlfriend, Katie McBanawa, and we know she was the person communicating between the Adelsons and the hitmen. At 10:06 a.m., Charlie calls Wendi. It was only an 11-second call, so I don't think they talked. Charlie then called Katie McBanawa again at 10:09 a.m. So you can see there was a lot of chatter going on between 3 of the convicted co-conspirators. Charlie Adelson, Katie McBanawa, and Donna Adelson. And Wendi Adelson was also involved in all this chatter. But of course, we don't know what they were saying in all of these calls. After Charlie's call to Katie McBanawa at 10:09 a.m., there are no further communications up until the time that Dan is injured. And again, he is injured between 10:55 a.m. and 11 a.m. At 11:42 a.m., just about 45 minutes after the crime, Wendi calls Dan's phone, and of course he doesn't pick it up. Wendi's call at that hour, if she did know what was going to happen to him, allegedly, seems to be designed to help her establish her alibi, in my opinion. Again, Wendi Adelson has never been charged in connection with this crime, so she is considered innocent. But to me, this call is like Wendi saying, look, Officer Isom, there's a call from me to Dan at 11:42 a.m. This means I wasn't aware that he had been injured. Now, 1 minute later at 11:43 a.m., Wendi texts her friend Janine Silberman to set up lunch for that same day at the Mosaic restaurant. Then between 11:43 a.m. to 11:46 a.m., Wendi and Janine exchange 6 text messages. Now, by that point, the hitmen are well on their way out of Tallahassee and headed home to Miami. In French, it's Miami. At 12:27 p.m., so that would have been approximately an hour and a half after Dan was shot, Wendi calls somebody named Joe Davis. The call lasts 1 minute and 35 seconds. Joe Davis is a criminal defense attorney in Tallahassee, Florida. That's an interesting call, right? Why would Wendi be calling him at 12:27 p.m.? This is before she knew, allegedly, that Dan had been shot. She's not at the police station. Technically, she doesn't even know about the crime, right? 2 minutes later, Wendi calls Laura Bunkowski. The call lasts for 40 seconds. Laura is one of the women that Wendi dined with at Mosaic Restaurant on Friday, July 18th, the day of the crime. So this is probably Wendi making plans with Laura for that lunch. At 12:30 p.m., hitman Sigfredo Garcia calls Katie McBanoa. This is when Garcia powered his phone back on. Garcia says it's done. And what he means is the crime is done. At 12:31 p.m., Wendi calls Jeff Skopek, and they talk for 16 minutes and 21 seconds. As Wendi speaks to Jeff Skopek, who is a colleague of Dan Markel's and a friend, I believe they went to Harvard together. As Wendi's talking to him, she's driving close to the crime scene. This is when she claims to the police that she was simply trying to take a shortcut to the ABC liquor store to buy a bottle of bourbon for a friend's Stock the Bar party. Note that there were other liquor stores closer to Wendi's rental home and closer to the restaurant Mosaic, where she was going to be going for lunch. In my opinion, Wendi drove to ABC Liquor because she was dying to see if the hired hitman completed the job of unaliving Dan Markel. Clearly, this is just my opinion and I am speculating. Wendi has not been charged with a crime, so she's presumed innocent. I also believe that selecting a bourbon named Bullet Bourbon was no coincidence. To me, this feels like dark humor. I mean, why did she pick that particular brand on that day? Wendi claims to only know how to get to ABC Liquor. That was the only liquor store in town she was familiar with. We know, however, that there are other liquor stores in the area closer to her home and closer to the restaurant she was going to be dining at with her 2 friends that afternoon, Mosaic Restaurant. Now, Jeff Skopek, the guy that Wendi is talking to as she's driving near the crime scene, he is a former associate of Dan Markel's from his Harvard days. Wendi claims that she spoke to Jeff to talk about a friend who had just had a baby. But the timing of Wendi's calls to Jeff Skopek during this critical period of the day, again just an hour and a half after Dan Markel was shot at, is highly suspicious. Did Wendi really just call Jeff to chat about a mutual friend's baby, or was the call about something more nefarious? Or was Wendi simply trying to add events to her timeline in order to establish a thorough alibi for that morning? Only Wendi and Jeff Skopek know what they talked about. Wendi made it to the Mosaic Restaurant around 1 p.m. She had lunch and then was approached by the Tallahassee PD, and she was driven down to the station for an interview. Now, Wendi claims she tried to drive up Trescott, where Dan's house was, as a shortcut to get to that ABC liquor store. But Wendi told Detective Isom of the Tallahassee PD that she could not drive up Trescott because it was blocked off. Wendi said she assumed it was because maybe a tree fell during a storm. But listen, in order for Wendi to have seen the crime scene tape where it was and where it was blocking the road near Dan's house, she would have had to have driven more than a mile down Trescott. She could not possibly have seen the crime scene tape from the intersection where she said she turned around. And now, thanks to video footage sent in to the YouTube channel Moms for Justice, which I'll leave a link to in the description, we can actually experience the drive onto Trescott that Wendi would have taken in order to see that the road was blocked near the crime scene. You will see that Wendi drove quite a long way up Trescott Drive. To me, this whole entire liquor store drive was BS. I believe Wendi drove this route because she was curious. She was dying to drive by Dan Markel's house to see if the crime had actually taken place and to see if anybody knew about it yet. She wanted to see if the cops were over there. She had no idea. Curiosity got the best of her that day. And even Charlie Adelson said in one of his jailhouse calls to his mother Donna before she was convicted that Wendi just couldn't help herself. She had to drive over there. I'm hoping that Wendi's curiosity that day is part of what ends up sinking her if she does get charged, if the prosecution do feel that they have enough evidence to charge her. So I'm going to play that video for you again, the drive that Wendi would have taken onto Trescott. It would have been in 2014 though, so the trees that you see in the video are much more bushy and green and bigger than they would have been in 2014, but you definitely get an idea of how far she drove. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you next time on Bed Crime Stories. Please smash that like button. I hope you guys are having a great day. Tell yourself that something cool is going to happen today, something good. Rewire your brain so that it has positive thoughts. This is what we need to be positive. Love you.
Here we go. We are going down Centerville Road right now. And right here, boom. That is Trescott Drive on the right-hand side. Right there is where she says the crime scene tape and police officers were. Okay? And she couldn't turn on to Trescott because of that. So, we're going to start counting the speed bumps to Dan's house. You ready? We're going to make a right-hand turn. Now we're on Trescott. Continuing along on Trescott. We have to go 5 speed bumps. Boom. Number 1, speed bump. Beautiful neighborhood. I want you to imagine how long it takes her. 2 speed bumps. By the way, thank you, Illegal Focus, for the amazing footage. They took the drive. 3 speed bumps. It's quite a ways. Don't forget, she said the crime scene tape was way back there when she had to make that turn. 4 speed bumps. Hang in there with me. Yep. It's coming. Here comes out of the speed bump. And I'm going to pause it right there. This is where the crime scene tape was at. This is where the police officer was, and this is where he saw Wendi Adelson do a K-turn. It's a very narrow road, so it was kind of very hard for her to make that K-turn. She stuck out because she was basically hurrying and trying to flee. Okay, here's the thing. Wouldn't you be concerned for your children? He was the last person to have custody of the kids that night, the night before. It was his scheduled visitation time. And that was something that Wendi would have known that morning.